because it's an amazing experience, an amazing opportunity. One of the things I most appreciate about that time is not the opportunity to talk, but the opportunity to listen. Not just to listen to what other people have to say about their own lives, but after you have this time of talking, these friends who are going to be praying for you, not just that day, but throughout the year, they take this time and they ask you questions about what you've said. Year in and year out, the thing I discover is that they have this ability to take your experiences and the way that you've talked about them and thought about them, and they have this opportunity and this ability to reframe them and to help you see them in a different light and to understand what's happened to you and what you've experienced and how you interpret it quite differently than you would on your own. It's an incredible gift to have friends who are able to do that. Part of the gift is that many times when they hear something that you've expressed as a challenge or a difficulty, they reframe it and they see it as an opportunity and oftentimes even as a gift. I hope that that's something that happens in the life of our church on a fairly regular basis, that we're people who are able to share life together in such a way that we can truly listen to each other and truly be heard. And when we're heard, give people the opportunity to help reframe the things that happen in our lives, to see so much of what we've been given and so much of what we have as gifts that have been given by God, and to reframe the way we see it. And I believe that the reason that we're able to reframe it is because we believe in the good news of the gospel, God who takes things that are broken and puts them together and makes something new out of them. And it helps us to see the world and see everything in a completely different light. You know, as we preach through stewardship, as this is our final stewardship Sunday, one of the things I hope that it's done is it's helped to reframe a little bit what stewardship is all about, because I know what people think. They think that when you're preaching about stewardship, no matter what happens, you have the same punchline at the end, which is, blah, 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 give more money next year. I know that's what people think stewardship sermons are all about. No matter what the text is, I know it because I can see it in people's faces. You know, when stewardship comes up, people aren't listening quite as intently because they all know what's coming. But it's not really true. The other thing I've noticed about stewardship season is that when it comes to stewardship season, usually after the first Sunday, you know, when you greet people back in the area, the lobby behind the sanctuary, I have someone come up to me invariably, and this is what they say. Whew, well, you made it through that one, but you're glad to have that behind you. Because people seem to have this idea that preaching on stewardship is some kind of a burden that you carry all year long as a pastor, and you dread its coming, and you don't want to talk about stewardship at all. Well, I have to be honest with you. I don't look at preaching about stewardship with dread, but I do look at it with a bit of fear and trepidation. Not because of how you're going to respond, but because whenever you preach a sermon, you're always first preaching to yourself. You end up asking yourself all along the process, what kind of a steward am I of the things that God has given to me and entrusted to me? How am I using what God has blessed me with? When you think about it and when you examine those things, it's a challenge, and it's difficult to consider because it's always a challenge to know. It's always a challenge to look at that because as we think about what God has given us, you know, with any situation like with stewardship, the question is like, well, what's the ask? What do you want me to do? What do I need to give? When you look at Scripture, the answer, it seems, is pretty clear. Give it all. Give everything. And hopefully now that we know that, I can make it a little easier on us. Since we know what the ask is, give everything, we can think about what it means to do that. One of the things that strikes me about stewardship often is that I think that we, as Christian people, often misunderstand it. We think that stewardship ultimately is about money, because that's the way the church has talked about it for decades, for centuries. We've talked about it as money. And it has to do with money, but it doesn't just have to do with money. It has to do with a whole lot more than that. If you've been here throughout our stewardship series, if you remember the first Sunday 4 weeks ago, we preached on Psalm 24. And Psalm 24 starts out like this: "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." And we use that to try to lay the foundation for what stewardship is all about. That stewardship starts not with, you got to give something, but instead with, the Lord owns everything. Everything that we have belongs to God. And we respond to God's ownership, and we respond to God's invitation, and we respond to God's generosity by being like God and being generous in turn. That's how we respond to the generosity of God. But there's this other thing that struck me as I was studying stewardship this fall, and I was just thinking about what the sermons would be about, and also when I wrote the stewardship devotional that we have. The thing that struck me is throughout the Old Testament, but especially in the Psalms, the scriptures talk all the time about stewardship. But one of the things that's interesting is it talks about stewardship in the context of worship. When the scriptures, and the Psalms especially, tell us about the earth being the Lord's and everything in it, and our response to it, the natural response always is worship. We worship the Lord in response to God's generosity. And think of the psalm that we read this morning in Psalm 100. It says, "Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth," every single person. "Worship the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing." There's this beautiful image of worship, of the whole of creation joining together in worship. And then the psalmist goes on, he says, "Because we are his people, the sheep of his pasture." We worship God because we know that our very selves, our whole being, everything about us belongs to the Lord. Now, when we use this word worship, it's actually a translation from a Greek word, which was transliterated into English as liturgy. Now, you usually think of liturgy as something that's in a more traditional worship setting, but every church has a liturgy of its own. We all have the way that we do our worship and the order and the way that it's put together. But liturgy actually has a particular meaning. What it means is the work of the people. It's the work of the people of God. Part of the beauty of that is that there's no beginning and no ending to worship. Sometimes that we think our worship, the place that we come together to sing praise and to lift our hearts in prayer and to join in song and to hear the word and to respond to that, we think it all happens right here in this place. But if you think about worship as the work of God's people, it's work that goes beyond the doors of the sanctuary. It goes beyond the doors of the church. And as a matter of fact, it ends up being everything that we do is an opportunity for us to worship, to do the work that God has given to his people. Worship doesn't end here. And here's the thing. If we think back and we think what I just said, that stewardship is expressed in worship, but worship doesn't just happen here, but worship happens everywhere. It means that stewardship really is the stewardship of all of life. Everything that we have, everything that we are, every gift you have, every skill you have, every relationship, all of these are gifts from God that God asks us to use wisely and well and in his service. In the Psalms, it places it in the context of worship. In the passage we read from 1 Peter, it puts it in a different context. It puts it in an end times context. Think about how Peter starts this passage. He says, "The end of all things is near. Therefore, be serious and discipline yourselves for the sake of your prayers. Above all, maintain constant love for one another, for love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaining. Like good stewards of the manifold grace of God, serve one another with whatever gift you have received." I said a few weeks ago that I think that Psalm 24 is the foundation of stewardship. The foundation of stewardship is that The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. Stewardship starts when we reframe our lives in the context of belonging to God, and that God is the giver of all good things. I believe that this passage from 1 Peter are kind of the marching orders for good stewards. Because in this psalm, in this letter, 1 Peter's writing to this distressed community, and what he says, discipline yourselves, for the end of all things is near. And then he tells us what it means to be good stewards. He tells us, welcome one another. Tells us, be hospitable. He says, love one another, for love covers a multitude of sins. And then he has this remarkable passage where he says, like good stewards of the manifold grace of God, serve one another with whatever gift each of you has received. When I was preparing for this sermon, that verse slapped me in the face. Like good stewards of the manifold grace of God. You know, that word manifold means like many or multiple, the many graces of God. The thing that slapped me across the face is this. I don't usually think of myself that way. I don't know how many of us do. That we are the stewards, the caretakers, the people who have the opportunity to give away the manifold grace of God. Do you think of yourself as a caretaker of the grace of God, of the manifold grace of God? Do you think of yourself as somebody who God thinks highly enough of to give his incredible grace so that we can watch over it and care for it and share it with the world? Is that the way that we think of ourselves? As people who are the stewards of the manifold grace of God. What does it even mean to be a steward of the manifold grace of God? I think what it means is that we can reframe our lives and understand everything that we do is a reflection of the goodness and the grace of God, because as Psalm 100 says, we are his people, the sheep of his hand. That we belong to him, and what we do and how we live and what we say and how we treat the people around us is a reflection of the grace of God, or it can be. So what does it look like to be a good steward of the manifold grace of God? Sometimes I think it means that we hold our tongues when we have something to say, because we know by saying it's not going to build anybody up, but it's going to tear someone down. Sometimes it means knowing that you're busy doing something, but there's somebody else you know who needs something from you. They need just a word or a moment of your time. And it's the ability to set aside what you're doing, what you think is most important, and instead to focus on the other person, because you know that they need to experience some grace, some mercy, some presence. And by doing that, you're sharing the manifold grace of God. It means that we build time into our lives to serve other people, because by doing that, we share the manifold grace of God. To be a good steward of the manifold grace of God is to think of ourselves as people who have the opportunity to speak the truth into people's lives in ways that are helpful, and the ways that build people up. You know, one of the things sitting in that circle of my pastor friends that's so striking to me is in that moment I realize that they are the people who are sharing with me the grace of God by the things they say, and by helping me to sometimes see my life in a different way than I see it when I'm stuck in my own stuff. To be a good steward of the manifold grace of God is to be a person who sees all that we have as a gift from God, and to live a generous life, to give to the work of God's people, and to give generously. Peter goes on here and he says, serve one another with whatever gift you have received. One of the things that's striking to me about that is I think that so often we think that the gifts we've received are to be used for our own benefit, to get further ahead. But Peter says that we are to use the gifts that God has given us for the sake of others. And then he goes on from here and he says, if you've been given these particular gifts, he says, if you have the gift of speech, you are to speak as if they are the very words of God. He says, whoever serves must do so with the strength that God supplies. Why? So that God may be glorified. What it sounds like to me is it sounds like Peter is talking about worship as a way of life. If our worship is a response to the grace of God, and our whole lives are shaped by the grace of God, then all of life is worship. All of life is response. All of life is being a steward of this manifold grace of God. So earlier in this sermon, I said that, what's the ask? What is God asking of you? Not Ryan. What is God asking of you? The ask is that you would give everything, give it all. And I know when I hear those kinds of things, and even when I say them, the first thing that comes to my mind is this: that's impossible. I can't do that. And at this very moment, you may be right. But one of the things I've learned as I've gotten older, and it took me a long time to learn this, is we can only start right where we are. For years, even still, I'll have this vision of the way I think things should be. And then I'll be deeply disappointed that I'm not there, and instead I'm right here. And sometimes that disappointment stops me from even starting, because I think it could be so much better, but there's so far to go, I don't know. But what God calls us to do is to begin to take some steps. If you saw on your pledge card, we put on there this box you could tick that you were going to take the 60-day tithe challenge. The reason that we did that was because we wanted each person to have an opportunity to commit to something bigger than what we ordinarily do. And by doing that, to take a step of faith. We know that for many people, the idea of tithing for years is beyond comprehension. But to tithe for 60 days is perhaps a possibility. To give 10% for 2 months is something that many of us possibly feel like we could do. And the reason we gave that challenge is because we believe that living faithfully often starts with taking steps, not imagining where we should be, but starting right where we are today. And this is one of the things I've found in my own life, and I know there are people here who could attest to the same thing. What I find is that often I feel stuck. And when I feel stuck, the thing I need to do is I need to take a first step, and I need to trust that God will be there. And when I take that first step and I find that the Lord is there, what that enables me to do is to take another step, and then another step after that. But the thing is, we can only start in the place where we are right now. So for some of us, it may not be ticking that box. It may be something else. There may be something else in your life that you feel you need to offer to the Lord and you need to give to Him today. And you need to trust that God is going to start something new or end something old in you, and this is the day to begin. Well, how do you do that? You start right where you are. Can't imagine that you're somewhere else because you're not. It begins with one step. One step of trusting the Lord and finding that He's trustworthy. Then we find that He's trustworthy in one thing, we'll find that He's trustworthy in another, and then we can step and we can walk toward being people who give it all. So where do you begin? You begin right here. How do you begin? You stop and you pray. You think about how God is calling you to take a step toward giving your whole self to Him. And then what do you do next? Maybe you tell somebody. Maybe you write it down. Maybe you put it on the prayer wall. Maybe you write it on the board. But you take some step and commit ourselves completely and fully to the Lord. What does God ask you to give of yourself? He asks you to give it all. Where do you start? Right here. When do you begin? Right now. Let us pray.